Okay, I believe we are live. Welcome. Joining me tonight is Benny and Ozzy. We're going to discuss the evidential problem of suffering or evil and how it relates to animal suffering. All right. So starting off, I'll just give a quick introduction to the problem of evil. There's kind of two forms. One's the logical problem from evil, and that was expressed by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. He stated, God either wishes to take away evils and is unable, or he is able and is unwilling, or he is neither willing nor able, or he is both willing and able. If he is willing and unable, he is feeble, which is not in accordance with the character of God. If he is able and unwilling, he is wicked, which is equally at variance with God. If he is neither willing nor able, he is both wicked and feeble, and therefore not God. The evidential problem of evil is more of a inductive or probabilistic version of the argument. And it basically says not only there's an evil in the world, but there's a lot of evil in the world. And if an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God existed, there would not be all this gratuitous evil in the world, because obviously he would have the knowledge, the power, and the goodness to at least reduce the amount of evil in the world. A very simple version of this argument goes as following. Gratuitous evil exists. Gratuitous evils are incompatible with the God of theism, which is omnipotent, omniscient, and all good. Therefore, the God of theism does not exist. So that's how the argument goes. And then something that's very apparent in the world with suffering is the existence of animal suffering. Many animals eat and survive by killing each other. Every day, millions of animals are tearing each other apart in order to survive, and this has been going on for millions of years. So animal suffering, I guess, is an example of the gratuitous evil or suffering that we see in this world. For thousands of years, theologians and philosophers have been describing Theodicies to resolve the argument from evil. A theodicy is an attempt to answer questions about why a good God would permit all the evil and suffering in the world. Some examples of a theodicy is the unknown purpose defense, where God allows suffering to occur for a good reason, but that reason isn't either known to humans or we can't comprehend it. Another argument is the free will defense, which says that God has to allow some existence of evil to preserve humans' free will. And philosophers like Alvin Plantinga are proponents of that. Another one is the character-building theodicy, where suffering exists in the world because God wants to give humans a chance to relieve suffering and build our souls and character to make us better people. Yet another one is the corrupt creation thesis, that we exist in a fallen world due to the sins of Adam and Eve or the rebellion of fallen angels. So the world has become corrupt because of the falling state, and thus animals suffer because of it. Yet another one is the Bible God is simply punishing us in general for our sins. You know, we disobey God, so therefore He punishes us, and that's why there's all this suffering in the world. And then a final one that I'll give is the apocalyptic explanation, that we exist in end times, and the forces of evil are ruling the world right now, and then the good God will intervene shortly and bring a new order to the universe. But until then, we live under the influences of evil, and thus, we have all this suffering. A few theologians and philosophers recognize that some of these Theodicies really don't work well with animal suffering. Some of these things can be applied to humans, but how do you apply them to animals? For example, living in a fallen world. Well, Adam and Eve sinned, and humanity faces the consequences of that. But why do animals have to suffer because of human sin? It seems to be nothing more than collateral damage. Why would an all God need animals to suffer for something that humans did, for example? That's one problem. And as far as free will, well, how does that affect the free will in regards to animals? Or do animals even have free will to even have it preserved, and so forth? So those are a lot of problems. Some philosophers get around the problem by simply saying that animals can't suffer at all. I think, and the classic example of that is René Descartes. He was a 17th century philosopher who basically said animals are pretty much as machines with no consciousness and reason. Ozzy, do you think you could elaborate more on that?
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. Yeah, as you said, Descartes was a 17th century, well, 16th and 17th century, sort of straddles those two centuries, French philosopher, and he wasn't just a philosopher. He was sort of, this was at a time before there was a real distinction between philosophy and the sciences. He would have done what was called natural philosophy. So his work straddles mathematics, geometry, optics, everything you'd find in physics, animal anatomy, and everything that we think of in terms of philosophy, like metaphysics and ethics and epistemology, on all of those subjects. And he took a dualistic view. He thought that mind and body were completely ontologically separate. They were literally separate substances. Mind and body were not just different in their properties. They were different in their properties because they were different in their very nature, in their very substance. So he divided mind and body. He divided all of reality essentially into two ontic categories. Things that had extension, what he called res extensa. That just means things that are extended. So physical objects exist in space. They take up space. They have extension. And then there was mental things, thoughts, feelings, desires, pains, tickles and itches, beliefs, all of these things, emotions. These were, as he saw them, non-physical. They lacked extension. That is, when you describe these things, you don't ever have to make reference to their size or shape. You don't even know what their size and shape would be. So they lacked res extensa. They lacked extension. They were not extended things. So they were what he called res cogitans. They were mental stuff. And because he bifurcated reality so decisively into two substances, he had to sort of figure out how do these two things interact, and that was rather complicated. But basically, he thought that in the case of humans, we were both physical and mental beings. And in the case of animals, it was a little less clear whether he thought animals actually had a mental life at all. It's possible that they were essentially robots. So Descartes thought that we were essentially robots, but we were robots that, because of God's divine will, we had souls and we had a mental life. We could enjoy subjective mental experiences. There's something going on inside. The lights are on, so to speak. But in the case of animals, not so clear. Now it's a little ambiguous what he felt on this, but certainly people following out of the Cartesian tradition thought that no. Animals don't have minds, they don't have feelings, they don't have any mental life. They really are just elaborate robots And so you have a philosopher and physician, another Frenchman by the name of Nicolas Malebranche, who believed that other animals other than ourselves were really robots. There was nothing going on. And to establish his conviction, he apparently once kicked a pregnant bitch in the guts, made her howl, and when a contemporary got upset about this, he sort of castigated his friend and said, no, you're getting excited over nothing. You need to worry about things that really can suffer. Kicking a pregnant bitch in the guts is just like squeezing a little horn. It makes a noise, but there's nothing going on inside. You don't need to be exercised about this. So this is sort of a legacy that lasted a long time. It sort of took a long time for people to appreciate animal suffering after this. But it has to be said that prior to Descartes, and this wasn't just Descartes' idea, by the way. I mean, he was sort of the person who sort of most strongly advocated this because of his strong ontic dualism, substance dualism. But he wasn't the only person to advocate this. But prior to Descartes, there was another view of animals that they thought of animals as having spirits and as being sentient and having feelings and having thoughts. In fact, in the Middle Ages, people invested animals with moral qualities, moral character. Animals could sin. Animals were put on trial. I mean, it sounds unimaginable to us. It sounds like a joke. But in the Middle Ages, animals were put on trial. I mean, if your ox trampled somebody and killed them, the ox could be put on trial. Now, this seems weird. I mean, we have the trial transcripts of this, so we know that this isn't just lore. We actually have ancient trial transcripts of these sorts of things. But it wasn't because that they had by our lights, an enlightened view of animal welfare and animal minds. It's that they imbued everything with a kind of spirit and a kind of will and a kind of intelligence. In the Middle Ages in Europe, for instance, they actually tried inanimate objects. If your cart came uncoupled from your ox at the top of a hill, rolled down a hill, and killed people in the market, the cart could be put on trial. And when it was convicted, it would be burned. Okay, so this idea of animism, of things having a life spirit, a life energy, a will, an intelligence, and moral qualities lasted a long time. And so oddly enough, Descartes' view was sort of a step in the right direction of getting away from this sort of broad animism and over-interpreting and imbuing things that don't have much of a mental life or any mental life with a mental life. But unfortunately, in Descartes' case, I think it went too far, and certainly in the case of Malebranche, it went extremely far, horrifically far, and we are sort of saddled with this legacy to this day. I'm an angler. I like to go fishing, and I fish with people who sometimes will say, fish don't feel anything. It's okay to sort of spend your whole day practicing catch and release, catching fish, hooking them, reeling them in, terrorizing them, injuring them, and then taking the hook out and just casually tossing them back into the water in a big splash with the view that, well, they don't have the relevant neurophysiology, apparently. They can't feel, right? They don't scream, certainly. They don't writhe in pain the way we would. And so there's this idea that other animals really don't have much of a mental life, and if they do, they don't have the mental life that's morally relevant. For instance, they don't feel pain, they don't suffer, and when they do suffer, it's not like we suffer.
Okay. Yeah. It's my understanding that Cartesianism kind of has worn out over the years, and most people accept that animals at least are conscious. That they're not robots. That they have brains and so forth. But there are some philosophers today which still kind of hold on to Descartes' view of animals. One example is Peter Harrison. He was a professor at the University of Oxford, and he simply declared that animals, we don't have good evidence to believe that animals are conscious. Another one is philosopher Peter Carruthers. He pretty much had the same view. Carruthers had the view, though, that we should be moral to animals, not because of the animals themselves, but because of ourselves. We shouldn't be cruel. um, because that kind of makes us worse people. So it was really in regards to our nature rather than the animal's nature. A kind of example or example of that is, imagine a woman is dating a man and is considering marrying him, and she discovers that the man beats dogs regularly, brutally beats them up, and she's horrified and shocked by how brutal and uncaring he seems, and but he says to her, don't worry, darling, don't worry, darling, I would even though I do this to dogs, I would never do this to you or any other human. And she would think, well, how can I know that? I mean, this guy is so brutal. How could I possibly imagine that he wouldn't act that way to myself or to other human beings? So that's why some philosophers say, well, we should be nice to animals anyway. Another philosopher kind of had what he actually used the term Neo-Cartesianism, and in a 2012 debate, or I'm sorry, 2011 debate that William Lane Craig had with Stephen Law, he used this philosopher as a source. The philosopher is Michael Murray, and he wrote a book called Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, Theism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. And part of the book came from a article he wrote called Neocartesianism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. Murray and Craig argue that most animals may be able to feel pain, and they are conscious, but they're not actually aware of the pain. And Craig actually said in debate, your cat may be in pain, but it really isn't aware of being in pain. And what they mean is they describe 3 levels of pain awareness. One is just a noxious stimuli resulting in an adverse behavior. So like you poke a amoeba with a pin, it would react, but it's believed that it's not really in pain. And then the second level is a first order subjective experience of pain, where somehow you experience a pain, but you're actually not aware that oneself is experiencing pain. And then they claim a third level of pain, which is a second order awareness that one is oneself experiencing. And Craig and Murray claim that only the higher primates, which are basically the apes and humans, have this self-awareness, this pain awareness. Craig states for that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness, and this is centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section of the brain that is missing in all animals except for the higher primates and human beings. And therefore, even though animals are in pain, they aren't aware of it. They don't have this third order pain awareness. They are not aware of pain, and therefore they do not suffer as human beings do. And then, let me see, Craig goes on and says, animals like horses, dogs, and cats would experience a second level pain awareness, but they do not experience a third level pain awareness, which is the awareness of second order pain. That is the awareness that one is oneself in pain. For that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness, and that is centered, again, in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section which is missing in all animals except for higher primates and human beings. He goes on to say, viewed theologically, this discovery magnifies the mercy and goodness of God. God has shielded almost the entire animal kingdom throughout its history from the awareness of being in pain. For those of us who are pet owners and lovers of animals, This is a tremendous comfort and a cause of praise to God for his goodness and wondrousness, even ingenious care of creation. Who would have guessed that God has done such a thing? These neurological insights, documented by Murray, greatly reduces the forces of the problem of evil posed by animal suffering. So these philosophers say, well, animals aren't suffering, so therefore there is no problem at all for animal suffering at all, because they simply don't suffer like humans do. So Craig's and Murray's position basically claim that animals, except for for higher primates and humans, are not self-aware, and thus are not aware they are in pain. And the reason why they are not self-aware is because they lack a prefrontal cortex. So I guess the question is Craig and Murray correct?
Yeah, let me chime in on that just a little bit from the biological side. Is that especially when you're talking about Descartes or any philosopher before the mid 1800s, probably the late 1800s, is they were living in a pre-Darwinian world. They didn't think about things the same way that we do now. We would say now that humans are animals, and that the tree of life is interconnected. And so it's not like there are people and then there are animals, and these are two distinct kinds of things. No, humans are animals in a very literal sense. And as far as the question of consciousness, I think that's an open question. We can't know what it's like to experience life as a horse or a dog or any other type of critter. But I think it makes sense for us to say that an earthworm in your garden doesn't experience pain in the same way as your cat or as a chimp in the zoo, or as yourself or your children. There have to be levels of consciousness. So there's a gradient, rather than at least our biology would tell us that there must be some kind of a gradient. If there's very simple consciousness, to where we probably would say something like an amoeba is non-conscious, even though it reacts to sense stimuli, there must be some gradient all the way up to where we are now. And so it's not as simple like yes or no. It's more like shades of gray. But to say that they don't experience pain, there's a reason. There's an evolutionary reason why we experience pain, and that's because it has an evolutionary benefit for us. There are people who can't actually feel pain. I mean, I heard a story about a little girl who's like 6 years old, and she can't feel anything, and she's always getting hurt because, she could literally put her hand on a hot stove and not notice that she's burning herself. She'd probably have to smell it to realize that something's going wrong here. She's got all kinds of bruises, and pain is a good thing. Pain protects you from harm. Pain is a warning that says, don't do that, don't go there. If your muscles, your skin, and your bones are about to be damaged, it tells you what to steer clear of. So pain is a self-preservation mechanism. And so it's not, when we're talking, we haven't really gotten directly to it yet, but when we're talking about the problem of evil itself, it's not pain that is inherently evil. It's certain types of pain, what we would call gratuitous pain, or inflicting pain. When we would say someone is evil, if they're going out of their way to inflict harm unnecessarily, just getting joy out of inflicting harm, that would be something we would call evil. It's not the pain itself; it's the misuse of pain. So that's really the only point I wanted to make, at least up to this point, about the biological answer for why we even have pain. Or animals would experience pain for the exact. Not that we are animals, but I'm just saying other non-human animals would experience pain for the exact same reason that we do. Is because it's a preservation, a self-preservation mechanism. And so to say that they don't experience it, I'm not even really clear what that means. If you've seen a dog, if you've ever stepped on your dog's paw or something, or you've ever seen something happen to an animal, their experience seems real to me. We can't ever know what it's like to live inside the mind of a dog, but it makes perfect sense that they're experiencing something, even if their consciousness is on a lower level, like the level of some people would say like a fully grown dog might be like has the mind of something like a human 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, and a chimp might have the cognitive ability of something like a 5-year-old. Those numbers are just for memory, so don't take that too literally. But so yeah, that's about it. So,
yeah.
Thanks.
Because Ozzy, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something about this argument about the presence or absence of a cerebral cortex and a fully developed frontal lobe being relevant to the experience of pain. It's certainly true that higher cortical functions are relevant to the existence and range of certain kinds of mental experiences that we can have. But there's absolutely no reason to think that the ability to suffer and appreciate your own pain is dependent upon these higher cortical structures in the brain that only exist in humans and are sort of late in the evolutionary picture. As Ben rightly said, pain exists for a purpose, biologically speaking, and it's a biological imperative that you not let your body undergo too much damage. And so organisms have to feel pain. Pain is a very primitive thing. It's a very primitive experience. It's arguably would have been sort of, in the evolutionary story, one of the first kinds of experiences that organisms could have. It delivers information to them about what's going on around them, their bodies, and what they should and shouldn't be doing, what they should be moving away from, and what they should be moving towards. So it's very primitive. It's important that they be that organisms be able to feel this. But this idea that you need these higher cortical functions is kind of odd. I mean, what Craig is talking about is a self-awareness of pain. Okay. But does it even make sense to speak of pain that you're not aware of? It's almost a contradiction in terms to say, oh, yeah, I'm feeling pain, but I'm not aware of it. Or my dog feels pain, but he doesn't feel his pain. My dog doesn't feel his pain? What does that mean? Of course he feels his pain. Right? Doesn't my dog get hungry? Right? Now, my dog can't think to himself the following sentence, I am hungry. Right? Dogs can't do that, right? But dogs can feel hunger, and they can feel pain, and they can feel lust, and they can feel fear, and they can feel excitement, and they can feel curiosity, and they can feel, apparently, enthusiasm when they see you. Does it make sense to say that they experience hunger that they're not aware of, lust that they're not aware of, fear that they're not aware of? What they lack, because of the absence of these higher cortical regions, is that they can't deliberately, at will, represent to themselves that they are in pain, that they are hungry, right? It's kind of like my dog. My dog sees my bowling ball, but he doesn't see that it is a bowling ball, okay? But he can see my bowling ball, right? He doesn't bump into it. He obviously sees. He has visual experiences. He sees my bowling ball. He doesn't just walk into it like it's invisible, right? But he just doesn't experience it as a bowling ball as opposed to some other kind of sphere. He can't just make these distinctions, okay? So other animals, presumably, are not able to represent their inner mental states and experiences to themselves, think about them, deliberate on them, and act on them in the same way. But that does not change the fact that they feel them. And to suggest that you can be in pain and be utterly unaware of it and not suffering it, I think is, well, I mean, it just sounds preposterous. It sounds like casuistry. It sounds like a desperate apologetic, a way to sort of get God off the hook here if you happen to believe in the kind of God that's supposed to be all good and so shouldn't permit gratuitous suffering. And I'll expand on one thing that Ben said. Ben was talking about the problem of pain isn't that there is pain, but that pain is gratuitous, and that gratuitously inflicting pain is wrong. But I would go even further and say that gratuitously permitting pain where you could effortlessly prevent it is also a moral evil. And if it turns out that there's a God who's omnipotent and could effortlessly prevent any and all pain, then I don't see why that God shouldn't be preventing that. And even when people posit that, well, maybe he has his reasons, there's some larger good. I mean, what larger good could there be that he couldn't, by exercising his omnipotence, achieve that same good without the pain? I mean, he sets the rules, right? If you're positing that kind of an omnipotent God. So I think that whole apologetic in terms of cerebral cortex and self-awareness of pain is I think, a specious distinction there that is irrelevant when we're talking about dogs. Yes, dogs can't feel certain things and can't think certain thoughts, but there's nothing to suggest that they don't feel pain. And the idea that they have pain but don't feel it, I think, isn't it a subjective mental state, a first-person experience? What are we saying is going on? That they really are zombies? Your pets are zombies? They have no feeling? They're just machines? We're right back to Descartes, if that's what we're talking about.
Right, right. And several neuroscientists were interviewed after the debate and were asked about the prefrontal cortex and if Craig's statements were true, and basically all of them said that they weren't. I'm going to butcher this guy's first name, Joaquin. It's Joaquin. Not sure how to pronounce that.
It's probably Joaquin, because like that actor Joaquin Phoenix.
Okay, yeah. Last name's Fulster, Fuster. He's the author of a classic textbook on the prefrontal cortex. He said that Craig's statement is wrong in several accounts, and explains that all mammals and some birds have a prefrontal cortex. They have, they're of varying sizes, but one neuroscientist said, size doesn't matter. It's more the neuro structure of it, which gives it its functionality. Several of the scientists also point out that in any case, even if some animals did have no or smaller prefrontal cortex, that wouldn't justify the conclusion that they are not aware that they are in pain. One Dr. Lori Morano of Emory University in Atlanta, she did a lot of studying on the brain of dolphins. And she said, we went from seeing the dolphin/whale brain as being a giant amorphous blob that does not carry a lot of intelligence and complexity to not only being an enormous brain, but an enormous brain with an enormous amount of complexity and a complexity that rivals our own. Dolphins have a sense of self, which could be tested by the way they recognize themselves in mirrors. When you get up in the morning and look in the mirror and know that's you have a sense of you, she says. In 2012, a group of neuroscientists got together in Cambridge, and they produced something called the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, where they basically declare that animals are conscious. A part of it says the absence of a neocortex does not appear to preclude any organism from experiencing affective states. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing a neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. And the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness goes on to say the neurosubstrates of emotions do not appear to be confined to cortical structures. In fact, subcortical neural networks aroused in affective states in humans also are not critically important for generating emotional behaviors in animals. Artificial arousal of the same brain regions generates corresponding behaviors and feeling states in both humans and non-human animals. Whenever in the brain one evokes instinctual emotional behaviors in non-human animals, many of the ensuing behaviors are consistent with experienced feeling states, including those internal states that are rewarding and punishing. So that came from a group of neuroscientists that generated the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. One of the neuroscientists in the group was Canadian Philip Lowe. He states, which animals have consciousness? We know that all animals, all birds, and many other creatures like octopus have the nerve structures that produce consciousness. This means that these animals suffer. it is an inconvenient truth. It was always easy to say that animals have no conscience. Now we have a group of respected neuroscientists who study the phenomena of consciousness, animal behavior, neural network, anatomy, and genetics of the brain. We can no longer say that we do not know. Is it possible to measure the similarity of between the consciousness of animals and birds and humans? That was left open by the manifest. Do not have a matrix given the nature of our approach. We know that there are different types of consciousness. We can say, however, that the ability to experience pleasure and pain in mammals and humans are very similar. I did a little bit more research. There's a debate on whether fish or not can feel pain. And that seems to be debated. There was an article in 2012 by a group of scientists that said that fish do not feel pain like humans do. Or actually, it was in 2013. Actually, it was a year ago. But then in 2014, I found another article that says the opposite. So whether or not fish can be in pain or experience the same pain that humans feel are up to debate. But if we assume that animals do have a prefrontal cortex, what does that say about Craig's God? You know, Craig said because his God did not give these animals a prefrontal cortex, that his God shielded them from the awareness of pain. So if they do have one, I guess, is it apparent that Craig's God did not shield the animal kingdom from pain, and thus we do have the problem of suffering? Another thing that comes up is, well, why didn't the Bible God give us a prefrontal cortex? Why didn't this God spare us from this pain awareness?
That raises some interesting questions, because that would be like, what if the universe was just as it is now, but God had made us all zombies? We were able to respond to stimuli in exactly the same way that we do, but we don't experience any of it. Sort of a universe absent Chalmers' qualia, right? You just remove all of the qualia from existence, but you still have a universe, but a universe missing what we would consider qualia. Would that universe be better because it's now lacking pain? I think all of us would probably, I mean, I'll tell you flat out that I would say no. I would say that this universe is far better than the universe full of zombie critters going around and not feeling pain. It's sort of, if pain is the price you pay to feel all of the other things we get to feel, then so be it. You know, I'm sort of jumping the gun and already sort of playing devil's advocate against the argument from evil, because it's not my favorite argument. I mean, I think it's a decent argument, but there are reasons why I think it's not the best. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I guess, and also many Christians are mind-body dualists. That that the mind is immaterial and it's separate from our physical bodies. But here we have Craig and Murray arguing that self-awareness comes from the physical brain, from the prefrontal cortex. So isn't that in conflict with mind-body dualism? That, you know, if the prefrontal cortex is what creates our self-awareness, why do we need this immaterial soul?
Yeah, right. That it raises the question. You know, Sam Harris is a neuroscientist, and he's raised that question in more than one public discussion. You know, how is it that everything that we know about the brain says that the brain gives rise to consciousness, and that your brain has physical structures that aid in, for example, your comprehension of language, or your memories of your past, or your biographical information about whatever, where you are right now and what you do for a living or whatever. All that is physically stored in the brain. But then how is it that your spirit rises off the body at death, as he said, recognizing grandma and speaking English? and there isn't an answer for that. You just say, well, God has the power to make it so. But it does, yeah.
There is a kind of answer to that. It's a different one, though, than what you were sort of imagining. But just if I could pick up on one point about Sam Harris's argument, his argument is, we have these specific structures, these rather well mapped out pieces of neural architecture, which, relative to different rates of neuronal firing, produce very specific types of mental events. If you damage a part of the visual cortex, you go blind. If I damage your auditory cortex, you go deaf. If I remove the olfactory bulb in your brain, poof, you can't smell anything. And if I muck about in certain other parts of your brain, your emotions will disappear. Certain other I can wipe out your memory by destroying parts of your brain. I mean, these structures actually have specific functions, and we know that by sort of destroying some of them, you can destroy parts of your mental life. And yet, upon death, when the whole brain is destroyed, somehow your mental life is preserved. Your sense of identity, your memories, your feelings, your emotional life, your thoughts. As you said, Sam Harris says, you can float off of your body, when you die on the operating table, and you can see grandma. None of this makes any sense. But there is a way for Christian theists, theists in general, actually, to make sense of all of this, of these facts that we've discovered about the nature of the brain, and that is to sort of situate the development of these ancient religions in their historical context, and appreciate that people back then didn't know what a brain was. I mean, Aristotle was one of the greatest empiricists of his day, and yet he didn't know what a brain was. He thought it was a radiator that cooled the blood. He had no idea it had anything to do with the thought process. People thought in the ancient world that your thought processes issued from like other organs, like your heart and your liver and stuff like that. When you get upset, you get a queasy stomach. When you're excited, your heart beats, and you feel a flutter in your heart when you see the one that you love and stuff like that. So people often associated emotional states and mental states and other conditions with specific organs in the body and locations in the body, not the brain. They didn't think anything was going on in the brain. Nobody knew what it was for. And it took a long time for people to sort of sort this business out. And consequently, the idea of the mind and the soul being sort of divorced from our physicality, specifically divorced from the brain, is a product of just ancient ignorance. But there are Christian theologians today and Christian philosophers who say, no, we don't have to sort of live in the Middle Ages or in antiquity here. We can actually posit Christian physicalism. You can posit that your brain causes your mind. God is omnipotent enough that if he wants to create matter that thinks, he can do that, right? An omnipotent being, if it wants to create matter that can be in a liquid state or a physical state or a gaseous state, why can't he create an organization of matter which, when it is organized in a certain way, can have certain mental states, have mental experiences, right? Why, after all, do we have brains? If God created us and created us with brains, why do we even have brains if brains don't produce our mental experiences? What the hell are they for, right? And some people will try to say, well, maybe the brain is like a receiver that picks up some, signal, some immaterial signal. What's the brain doing there anyway? It's still not doing anything that couldn't be achieved by supernatural means. So if you think that sort of your whole mental life is a kind of supernatural event or supernatural substance that doesn't require a brain and isn't produced by the brain, why do we even have brains? It's a superfluous organ. Mm-hmm. But there are Christian physicalists who've sort of gotten around this problem by saying, no, we have brains, and our brains produce all of our mental life. God can produce matter that can think and feel and suffer, and that sort of gets away from all of those particular problems. It doesn't get away from the problem of animal suffering. You still have the question of, well, why on earth are animals suffering? To what end do animals suffer, right? How could punishing Adam and Eve or something like that, and punishing us, why should that punishment sort of be extrapolate it to animals. Why should they be suffering? It doesn't make any sense. I don't think any of those theodicies make any sense. But in any case, there are sort of moves that Christian theologians and philosophers and apologists can make. Peter van Inwagen is one of these Christian philosophers who sort of says, no, I'm just going to go with a kind of physicalism, and that solves those particular objections.
Yeah, it appears that a lot of this is theologically driven. That in Christian theology, only humans are made in the image of God, and thus having a higher order of consciousness and awareness. So it sounds like a lot of these arguments really comes from that premise. Really, that's what I seem to be observing. As far as the corrupt nature theodicy, the story that the fall accounts for animal suffering. In the light of evolution, it seems like that really can't really stand up. Michael Murray, in his paper himself, actually admits this, and the paper is available online. It's called Neocartesianism and the Problem of Animal Suffering. He writes, traditional attempts to explain the reality of animal suffering and death as consequences of the fall appears mute in the face of the mounting evidence that humans were latecomers in the evolutionary derby. However, these early attempts to address the problem of animal suffering failed to provide a coherent and satisfying reply. That's why he goes on to explain his Neo-Cartesianism. A result of their fall, the corrupt nature, the corruption of the natural order of the planet, of what caused animal pain, was endorsed by people like C.S. Lewis and John Calvin and so forth. But if evolution's true, you have a whole history of animal suffering even before humans came on the planet. Before the fall, can the Bible, God, consider animals dying of cancer as very good, as he describes his creation in Genesis 1? Robert M. Price, in his book Evolving Out of Eden, states the following. He says, despite attempts to minimize the differences between biblical creationists and old earth creationists or theistic evolutionists, the theological problems created by such attempts to harmonize the Bible with billions of years are indeed significant. The order of events in Genesis 1 often have to be rearranged to accommodate such views, and those who wish to mesh evolution with the Bible must accept that there was death, suffering, diseases like cancer, and even thorns before the fall. But all those things are the result of sin. The scripture is explicit that thorns came after the curse. How could God call cancer very good? So I think that's some good points there. And if you think about it, if God used evolution to create life, there's a lot of issues with the method. God would prefer diversity, not heights of intelligence or awareness. Also, that this guy would be quite comfortable with endless horrible suffering and death because of all the suffering that's taken place. And also, this guy is quite comfortable with death. It's often said that it's estimated that 99.9% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. Those are all issues. And as far as and back to the prefrontal cortex, it makes you think: will non-Christians in hell have a prefrontal cortex? Will God spare us from the suffering by removing our prefrontal cortex in hell? And when I think about
spiritual bodies.
Yeah. Well, if it's spiritual bodies, then we don't have a prefrontal cortex, so we're back to the mind-body dualism problem.
Well, no, maybe the spiritual body does have a prefrontal cortex, because remember that the talk of spiritual bodies is not. I mean, Christianity imagines that you get a new body, a glorious body, after the resurrection, right? You're not Casper the Friendly Ghost without a body, right? You have some kind of glorified body, but it's there's nothing to suggest that there's no physicality there. A lot of people think this, a lot of Christians think this, but there's actually nothing to suggest that there's no physicality there. So, I mean, hell could be a place of physical suffering, and you could have a kind of spiritual body that's never going to degenerate. So and consequently, your spiritual prefrontal cortex is going to never degrade, and so you will never stop suffering. You'll always be able to experience the exquisite suffering of damnation.
Of course, the question that raises for me, and the one I've, when this comes up, is, okay, you die, you're some atheist and you die, and so you're dead, you're whatever, you're dust, you're just a body in the ground, and then God now has the option to leave you dead, or he can resurrect you, give you this incorruptible body that has a neocortex that can feel all the pain in the world, and hunger and loneliness and every other thing, and then punish you for not believing the right things while you were alive. I mean, he has those options. He can, and he has. I mean, if you want to talk about the argument from evil, this to me is the greatest evil. Hell, the idea of everlasting torture after death, is by definition, by purely mathematically, because whatever kind of suffering there ever has been while we're alive is finite. And once you compare that to a life that goes on infinitely, you're comparing, an infinite number to a finite number, and infinity over anything finite is going to be infinitely greater, just as a matter of math, right? So the whatever amount of suffering we've had on Earth pales in comparison to this idea of an afterlife torture prison for everyone who didn't believe and do the right things while they were alive. It's by far the greatest evil.
If Christian physicalism is true, then I've come up with a new version of Pascal's wager. So if we're going to go to hell and Christian physicalism is true, then we should get our neocortex removed right before we die. So when we go to hell, we won't suffer. But if there is no hell, well, it doesn't matter anyway. So there's a new version of Pascal's wager that us atheists and non-Christians should consider. So.
Well, presumably God's going to give you a new body that's incorruptible even when you go into hell. If that's the case, right? So.
Yeah,
you can blow your brains out before and kill yourself and hope that you avoid it. But just like if you happen to be sort of be shot in the head and you go to heaven and your brain has been blown out, God's going to give you a new brain, right? So if you do it to yourself and your destiny is hell, God could presumably give you a new brain that's going to go on forever.
Yeah, but apparently the Christian God does the opposite for his elect. The God removes their sin nature, right? So in fact, that gives them they become a new creation.
And that raises so many questions, because the most common objection to the problem of evil, at least as I've heard, is the free will objection, right? And so then you go to heaven, and apparently your sin nature is removed. But does that mean so you have no evil in heaven? So does that mean you don't have free will anymore? And
right.
if you do have free will in heaven, then it's possible to have a place where there's no suffering and yet people have free will. So they just can't have it both ways.
Right. Apparently, you get a spiritual lobotomy when you go to heaven.
Oh yeah. If you're just again, we're back to zombies. But if you're just sort of a slave. God just pre-programs into your head the types of things you're allowed to do. Yes, you're allowed to praise me. Yes, you're allowed to say how amazing I am. No, you're not allowed to think bad thoughts. No, you're not. It's just and if he programs us all just to be nice, then that's I've jokingly said punishment in heaven or hell, and people have asked me like, what do you mean punishment in heaven or hell? Well, because to me they're both punishment. I mean, the vision of heaven that they're describing is also punishment. It's just a different type of punishment. Arguably it's a more sinister punishment. The hell punishment is very direct. You're going to have physical torture. The other thing is you become this weird kind of mental slave, which they seem to think is great. I don't think it's great.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems like it seems like there's dilemmas on both ends. Like Ozzy said, you get your spiritual brain back so you can feel pain, but the saved get gets their spiritual brain altered so they no longer have their sin nature. So heads you win, tails I lose.
Yeah, it has the character of a kind of a red pill, blue pill. You're given the choice. Do you want to sort of, go into the matrix where you're going to live forever and you're going to suffer, or do you want to just go into the matrix? Your mind's going to be wiped. You're going to be given a new kind of mind, a mind that is content to endlessly worship a being, and where you will have no inclination, you will have no impulses to do the wrong thing. I mean, in what sense is that even still you? I mean, so the questions of personal identity loom very large here. Um, and I'm never quite sure how people reconcile that. I can't even, when I try to cast my mind back to what I used to believe, when I used to think that, all I can think of is that I probably had not thought these things through very well, because I can't remember how I sorted that mess out. But
Yeah, that question, it might have been Greg Bray had mentioned that, like, if my mother, he said this, he said, if my mother gets to go to heaven, she's resurrected and now she's in heaven, and but if she's not sad that her son, being himself, Greg, I think it was him anyway, if she's not sad and if she's not distraught that her own son, maybe more than one of her children, are not with her in heaven, and instead they are being endlessly tortured for having believed the wrong things, then that's not my mom anymore. It's some kind of a facsimile that maybe looks like her, might talk like her, but it's not her, because if it was actually her, she couldn't help but love her children. These were the people that she loved more than anything in her life, and now she dies and she doesn't care about them anymore. No, it doesn't wash.
there's a thought experiment that's used in philosophy at times, sort of um, the pain vanishing pill. Imagine I can give you a pill that will alleviate your grief at the loss of your child. So let's say that you've got a child, you've got a 9-year-old child, you absolutely adore this child, and the child is killed somehow, let's say in an accident, and the doctor says, okay, I'm going to give you this pill. You're going to simply be unconcerned about your child's death. You're still going to remember your child, but you're just not going to care that it's dead. I mean, you're going to care about the death of your own child the way you care about the death of a child that you hear about in some other world, some other part of the world. You're just, you might go, oh, what a sad thing, but that's it. You're sort of your moral concern and your grief will be no greater for your own child than for that. Would you take that pill? And you might, in the exquisite agony that you're feeling, say, yes, give me anything, make this hurt stop. You might take it in that moment. But if I ask you this before this happens, would you take that pill? I think most people would say, "Oh no, I would not want to take such a pill. That's a horrible thing. That would be a kind of lobotomy. That would be doing something to me. That uh, you know, you know, even something as horrible as grief actually has some functions and is a part of us, which we don't want to have."
Can you hear me?
Oh, can you hear me?
I can,
Oh,
but I don't know that. Well, Oz left.
yeah. So we had some sort of technical problem.
Yeah.
I just did a refresh, and I'm back. Let me see. Ozzy will join us again. I was about to invite more people in as well. Um, oh, here he is.
Hi, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. It seemed I was talking and then everything went quiet, and I don't know if anyone heard me or if.
Yeah, I think he kind of dropped off. We were. I brought up vegetarianism and Peter Singer, and you started talking, Oz. I guess if you could continue.
Oh, well, geez, I don't know where I left off. I think I may have talked for about a minute before I realized that there was no feedback from anyone because I have my camera off. I can't see if there's anybody on the other end. So the last thing I remember saying was just sort of talking about this thought experiment of a pill that sort of negates or annuls your ability to feel certain things, including certain forms of suffering, and we wouldn't necessarily want those gone, but heaven, because they serve a function, they serve a purpose. So some suffering can have value, but that is, once something terrible has happened, suffering can have some value. But we would rather not have the suffering and not have the events that occasion them in the first place, which a God would be capable of preventing. But when you imagine heaven, you're imagining a kind of, like as you said, a spiritual lobotomy.
Yeah, and I guess another argument is perhaps animals get to go to heaven with humans, and I think C.S. Lewis wrote about it, and I think he admitted that it's nothing more than guesswork, and the Bible doesn't. I think he said the Bible doesn't rule it out, but there's nothing that says that they get that benefit as well. But I'm not sure if that's any comfort or not to think that. Well, I guess it would be a comfort for a lot of people to know that they'll see their pets in heaven, I guess. But again, is there anything to suggest that? I don't know.
I mean, how big is heaven anyway? Because how many animals have died? And I mean, if all of them need to now be resurrected, do all the bacteria also get resurrected? I mean, what do they feed on? If you had to try to pack all of the animals that have ever lived on Earth for all of its billions of years worth of history, you'd need a planet bigger than Jupiter. You'd need multiple planets. I mean, if you follow those questions to their logical conclusion, the absurdity of it becomes really clear. Plants, I mean, are plants, do they have spirits? Some people would say yes. Do they get resurrected? Well, I mean, it's just so obvious, at least it's obvious to me, that this whole idea of heaven comes from our death aversion. It's not a logical idea. It's just we don't like the idea of ceasing to exist, and so we make up these stories, because when you actually try to make sense of it, it doesn't make sense.
Well, does that relate to how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, sort of thing? If it's I heard some people describe heaven as it's eternal for the elect, and thus it's timeless and so forth. But it's like, well, if it's timeless, what do people actually do in heaven? Like the way they describe it, it's like you're describing like you are when you're dead. When you're dead, it's timeless, right? And I would think to have a thought has to be sequential.
Yeah, I mean, well, is eternal the same as timeless? Because timeless would mean without time, and eternal presumably would mean infinite time.
Yeah, I mean, for all time.
Eternal would just mean time that just continues on forever, whereas a timeless state is very difficult to even imagine what that would be like. Because, like you said, I mean, we have experiences, they happen in sequence, and try to imagine, anything, a conversation, a non-sequential conversation, everything just happening at once. Or, I mean, just the idea, the concept of events, any kind of event, requires time. So for us to try to think of existence outside of time is, it's a phrase, you can put those words together into a sentence, but it doesn't actually turn into anything that really we can picture as being something even potentially real.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me. Oh, I'm sorry. Floyd, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Ozzy.
It's interesting to sort of note how historically there have been very vivid accounts, descriptions, and representations of hell. Everything from Hieronymus Bosch's paintings to, to just the standard images that you have of devils and pitchforks and lakes of fire and stuff like that, and Dante's hell. But how thin and uninspired and uninspiring visions of heaven are, right? I mean, there's a richness to imagining hell because we know what it's like to suffer and it's an awful thing. But it's hard to imagine eternal happiness where there isn't anything to accomplish, where there's nothing to acquire, right? There's no need to think in heaven. There's no need. You don't need a brain. You don't need to have thoughts. If all of your needs are met, if every desire is satisfied, whatever those desires are, let's say your desire is merely to worship God or something like that, and that desire is immediately gratified and met, you don't even need a mental life. And I think that's why these sort of descriptions of heaven are always, compared to hell, so insipid and thin and flat, and it's because there's simply nothing. There's nothing worth anything in heaven. When people imagine what it's like to be in heaven and sort of endlessly praising God and glorying in His magnificent presence, there's no reason to think. There's nothing to accomplish. There's nothing to do. There's no reason to have proficiencies or skills. There's nothing to try for. Everything is immediately gratified. I mean, you might as well just shoot up with heroin right now and get on with it.
It's a really good point. Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, if you think of somebody like Newton or Einstein, and what kept them going, what kept them engaged in life, if not for the mystery and the possibilities, the endless possibilities of the unknown, and what was left to discover and what was left to do. And think about the cosmologists and the astronauts and how they think about that next frontier, exploring that next frontier, or think about an athlete, somebody like a Muhammad Ali or a Michael Jordan, and you think, what do these men live for? They live for that competition. They thrived. When they were at their most alive was when they were in the moment, right, in the middle of the heat of a battle, or that's a metaphorical battle, but there are literal, warriors who would have felt the most alive in battle, literal battle, hand-to-hand combat. So, I mean, all of that is just gone, and so in this vision of heaven, all of them, what is success if not for the possibility of failure, right? Or what is discovery if everything is already known? So, I mean, it doesn't, yeah.
I have a question. That what you and Oz just said seems really contradictory to me. So what you were saying earlier, that if there was a God that was all-powerful and was capable of making it the case where you had no suffering, no pain, no worries, no wants, no nothing, that would be the way it should be done. And then when you discuss the same traits in heaven, you're like, it's complete nonsense. It makes no sense. My pain is this, failure is this, being wrong. I mean,
no, I didn't say that.
Doesn't
I didn't say that. I don't know if Ozzy said it.
I'm not quoting you verbatim. I'm not quoting you. But when you talk about the idea of a heaven, not you.
Okay.
You're here. We're here. But when you talk about the idea of a heaven, having all of these traits that you said that a God should do earlier, now you're like, that's complete nonsense. But earlier you're saying that should be the case. This is very confusing.
Are you talking to Ozzy? Because I didn't say that. Are you talking? You might be talking.
Yeah, it's more directed or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I can address that. My view is what I was talking about there is that heaven offers nothing desirable. It doesn't. I'm hearing a funny noise or feedback from somebody. I'm not sure who it is.
It might be my fan. Give me a second.
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah. the prospect of heaven, as it's usually described, is unappealing. There's nothing to desire. There's nothing to want. There's a world of difference between saying, I'd like to see suffering reduced or alleviated or even entirely eliminated, and saying that elimination would evacuate joy from your life. I mean, heaven could be full of all kinds of pleasures and all kinds of wonderful things. It's just that we're never told what any of those are. And everything that we are told about heaven involves basically that we're going to be in the presence of God. It's going to be enormously gratifying, and we're going to be filled with a desire to worship Him, and we'll have no evil thoughts. But there's actually no positive account there. There's nothing there that sort of you think, oh yeah, well that sounds like fun. That sounds desirable. It doesn't actually sound desirable. Even when I was a theist, a Christian theist myself, I didn't think that sounded desirable. I went along with it. I sort of repeated that, but there was nothing desirable about that. So you can imagine a world with less suffering, or even no suffering. That wouldn't necessarily be a world without accomplishments, and with joy, and without joys and satisfactions. The problem of suffering isn't that there is suffering, as Ben stated earlier, and as I repeated a little while after. It's that there's avoidable suffering. There's gratuitous and needless suffering. I mean, just think of animals, for instance. Okay, I mean, we're in a position, because we're social creatures and we have the intelligence that we do and the civilizational institutions that we now have, that we're able to sort of make life pretty good for ourselves, and we can even make dying pretty good. But I mean, if you think about animals out there, almost every animal, except for the few that are our pets, they die horrific deaths. Okay, they die from predation, they die from illness, they die from diseases, they die from parasitic infections, they die from horrific injuries, and an alarming number of them die from starvation. Okay, the amount of misery there is incalculable, and that's that's without anybody trying to inflict torture on them. That's without anyone sort of trying to harm them, any humans trying to exploit them or misuse them or anything like that. That's just what goes. Now, a God that was omnipotent could have exercised its omnipotence to create beings that were simply not subject to these sorts of things, right? They could still feel hunger, for instance, but it wouldn't just be, horrifying. It wouldn't have to lead to starvation if you didn't eat. You could have an appetite. I mean, think about an appetite like lust. We all feel lust, and it mounts, and it's uncomfortable until that is relieved in some way, and it's great when it is. But it's not killing you. it's not torture. Not to have it satisfied. It's unpleasant, but it's endurable. Okay. I mean, imagine if not eating, not being able to find food was like that, right? That would be already a better world. So it just seems to me that to sort of imagine that this is in some sense the best of all possible worlds, given this God with these omni-attributes, who's omnibenevolent, that is all good. He could have made a world that is, if he made the world that was even one iota better than it is now, that would be a better God, and it would be, because he would have created a better world. So that's where the problem is. It's the problem that there is, in fact, avoidable, gratuitous suffering and infliction of harm, and the permittance of harm that is avoidable, effortlessly avoidable. That's the difficulty. And the problem with heaven is that it would rob us, as described, would rob us of any happiness. We're just told that it would be happy, but there's nothing about it that sounds like it would actually be fulfilling and satisfying any more than shooting up with heroin it would be.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and I agree with that, but I still, with you were saying about just one pinch less of suffering, or even if being hungry was the worst thing that we could experience, right? But then we wouldn't know of any worse things that there were unless we could imagine it. If we can imagine it, then we can experience it in a way. So if being hungry that didn't lead to some sort of horrible starvation was the absolutely worst thing that we could experience, it would then be the worst thing that we could experience, and we would still, if we were in that world, we would still have, your argument would still stand.
I'm not sure I'm getting your point. Could you restate it? I'm afraid I didn't get it.
Can I try? I think I get what you're saying, and I think it's a valid point. Is that it's something like if we can imagine something like the worst possible situation that you could be in, something like being tortured, all the different ways that it's possible to be tortured. You can think about watching your loved ones be tortured. You can think about just sort of a worst case scenario for what can happen to you. Well, and that's what we can imagine from the way the world is here, right? But if one second. Anyway, can you guys still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. If we were in a different kind of a world, and if the most extreme suffering was something like what she just said, hunger, then what would happen is that that would be from our reference frame. From our reference frame, would be shifted to the point where minor inconveniences like a hangnail might seem like a big deal in that world, and something like hunger would just be unbearable because it's a matter of the reference frame.
Yeah, that I think is relativizing the idea of happiness and suffering in a weird way. That I think is sort of false to psychological fact. It's certainly true that if you've endured more suffering, that will sort of allow you to sort of better handle less suffering along the way. But that doesn't change the fact that, objectively speaking, some things are worse than others. That some things are, in fact, more intolerable, more unpleasant than other things, just as a matter of objective fact. So even if you couldn't tell, so this is an epistemological problem that's being raised. What if we lived in a world where the worst thing that you could have is sort of, I don't know, cracking a nail or stubbing a toe, and then well, stubbing a toe can be pretty bad, but I don't know, getting an eyelash in your eye, but supposing that was the worst that any human could feel, then presumably that would be sort of the benchmark. That would be the standard of absolute horrific suffering. We wouldn't be able to know about anything else. We might try to imagine something worse than that, but we might be able to do it, not able to do it. It would be a failure of imagination owing to a lack of experience with anything worse, okay? But that wouldn't change the fact that there, in fact, would be something worse. We're just not in a position to know what it is. And so I don't see how that actually vitiates my argument, because the question isn't about whether or not, how we would know if something were better or worse, but rather what would make something better or worse. What would be a greater evil and what would be a greater good. And that, I think, is independent from how we in any particular instance would know if there was a greater evil or good. So all that one needs to sort of animate the argument against these theodicies based on the problem of suffering is to point to the fact that there is a certain level of suffering. Let's say that's not the highest level of suffering imaginable. It could have been worse. It doesn't matter. The point is, as long as it could have been better, then this God needs some principled reason why he didn't make it better. And simply saying, well, he does have his reasons, we don't know what they are, but just take it on faith that there are such reasons, is of course just hand-waving, because we're supposed to posit that this God is omnipotent and he gets to decide the very rules about how reality operates. Right? And that's the difficulty.
And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying, like, say our pain gets scaled down or our suffering gets scaled down. Like, it actually is created in such a way where this is the only breaking your nail is the worst thing that can happen. Experiencing hunger is the worst pain you can actually feel. Like, there is no universe where worse is the case, right? Your argument would still hold there, right? You could still make this exact same argument in that world. And then if it were diminished down even further, say, okay, now there's another, this universe is created in such a way where it is not possible to feel the pain of hunger. It is not possible to feel the pain of breaking your nail, but it is possible to feel the pain of a sunburn or something. Your argument will stand in every possible world until you're at a world where there is no suffering.
But does
Well, a possible world is a
like
possible world, not an
these
actual world.
Right, I understand that, but I'm just saying if the same argument could apply in any way that a God could have created the universe, right, then the only way for the argument or the complaint to ever go away is if the world or if the universe exists where there is zero suffering and zero pain, it doesn't exist at all, and now we're at the heaven scenario.
Well, no, it just has to be avoidable suffering. Right? What if there? I mean, if there is in fact unavoidable suffering, and there is a greater good that comes of suffering, then that's perfectly okay. It's just that there's no reason to think that we're in that circumstance. I mean, given the magnitude of the suffering that's around us, there's absolutely no reason to think, except that we are told that God is omnibenevolent. But for that claim that God is omnibenevolent, there is nothing that motivates anyone to suspect that there is a mitigating good that outweighs all of this evil and that justifies all of this suffering that we find. That's the problem. And now notice what happens if there's no God. Let's say that there's no God, okay? Or let's just say, you don't even have to imagine there's no God. Let's imagine, because this is an argument against a specific conception of God. It's not an argument against deism, for instance. But
Right.
an indifferent God or an indifferent universe, the problem evaporates. There's no problem, right? If the problem only arises because we posit an all-good, an omnibenevolent being. But the problem evaporates the moment you cease to posit that. The only thing that motivates one to think that there is a mitigating good is the claim that there is this God. Now we have to confect a reason why there is any evil in the first place. But if you don't posit an all-good God, it's not that positing a God, it's positing an all-good God, then the problem disappears. I mean, I seem to, I mean, my feeling is that I look around, the world seems to me to be a world of pitiless indifference. That's why there's suffering in the world. These things didn't happen for any particular good. We're not entitled to expect any particular good. It's only if we live in a world, a reality inhabited and created by a God that wants only the best and will do only that which is morally good and ideal, in fact. Only then are we in a position to say, well, wait a minute, why is there any hardship at all? Why is there any suffering?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I understand that this is geared towards the omnibenevolence. I get that, but I still. I don't know, and maybe you'd have to clarify for my sake, and maybe at another time if that needs to happen too. But I still don't see how the objection that you have would ever go away unless there was a state of no suffering.
That's right. Yeah. There can be no suffering if this omnibenevolent being exists, unless you can plausibly argue that there is a mitigating reason. There has to be a better good that militates against all of this animal suffering. And if there isn't a greater good that militates against this animal suffering, well, then nothing short of complete happiness would result. And of course, if complete happiness is sort of a contradiction, if the idea of heaven is sort of incoherent, it wouldn't be satisfying. Well, then again, there can't be this mitigating circumstance. So it seems to me either way, it's an argument in favor of my conclusion. But no, I see your point that if you sort of imagine if reality were better than it in fact is, one could still raise the same objection. Why is there the amount of suffering and hardship that there is? Right. That's absolutely true. But the question only arises because we posit this omnibenevolent God, and the only reason anyone is ever tempted to say there's a mitigating reason is because that is the only thing that will exculpate such a God.
Right. Yeah. Real quick, Floyd, and then I'll stop.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It seems to me that a Christian could just say, and I could be wrong, and I would disagree, but still, it seems to me that they could just say, hey, the suffering is to, teach you morality or some nonsense. But at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, there is a state of no suffering, and that's heaven. You know what I mean? And that's eternal to them. This is just a drop in the pan. Who gives a shit? The eternal part, the long haul, where you're going to be around forever, that is a state of no suffering.
For animals, though? Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the animals?
I got one quick question to raise for anybody interested. What about this idea that things that we value is it creates some of the heights of our experiences. If we value, you know, our friends, our family, our ability to do art or music, or my grandpa, before he died, he loved to golf, right? And he had like 3 strokes before he died, and this turned him into a grumpy old bastard because it was his favorite thing to do was to golf, and it was taken away from him, you know. And so, in the sense that to the extent that we can value something is to the extent that we can appreciate it, this goes to create the heights of our experiences. This goes to give richness to our lives. And if it seems to me that having these things that are highly valued to us necessitates the fact that if those things are removed, that the absence of that thing be felt. And this is one of the great causes of suffering in our world, be it animal suffering, human suffering, is, you know, you lose something that you didn't want to lose, but you lost it, and now it's gone forever, and you curse the universe and God and say, you know, why me? But isn't it necessary in some case? I guess that's really the sort of generic question I'm asking: doesn't the valuing of something necessitate that the loss be felt in some way? If it's to be truly valued, the loss is going to be experienced.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of a position that I take with it. Because if you take away all the pain and suffering, every little ounce of it, again, the way it seems to me anyway, it seems to be the case we would end up with something as nonsense and zombie and heroin-inducing as heaven.
Yeah, that's sort of where I was running the argument. I mean, you know, there's a reason why we feel pain. There's a reason why organisms feel pain, not just us, other organisms. And there's a reason why we feel satisfaction. There's a reason why we experience anticipation. There's a reason why we feel relief and things like that. These emotional, subjective, mental states exist for a reason. They permit us to survive. We have the kinds of emotional states that we have as the different kinds of creatures that we are, precisely because of the kinds of environmental pressures that have acted upon our ancestors. That's why we have the mental lives that we have. We have the mental capacities for joy and immiseration that we have. So we don't have to. There's sort of no great mystery about why is there happiness and why is there suffering. Why is there joy at accomplishment and why is there misery at being frustrated and stuff like that. We live in a world where it is necessary simply to exist, to continue to exist. That you accomplish certain things, that you feed yourself, that you find mate, that you secure shelter for yourself and protect your body, and all of these basic animal needs. And then there are greater happinesses that you can have, peace of mind and security, flourishing, a sense of accomplishment and power, social ease, the joys of friendship, all of these sorts of things. Some of which we can experience and other organisms can't. But I mean, the reason we have these capacities is because all of these feelings make it possible to provide motivations for an organism to move away from certain things that would interfere with its survival and move towards things that would conduce to its survival. And that's why we have these various emotional states. We don't have to posit this metaphysical supernatural architecture and design that tells you that this is the reason they're suffering is so there'll be some greater good in some afterlife. The facts about reality around us already explain to us why organisms have capacities for suffering and happiness and satisfaction and fulfillment and misery and suffering and frustration and all of that. The facts that are needed to explain that are already present in this world, and we don't have to invoke something metaphysically extravagant to explain any of that. It's all surplus to requirements.
Yeah, it makes you something that always confused me about Buddhism was its concept of suffering. In Buddhism, desire causes suffering, and if you eliminate desire, you eliminate suffering, and Buddhist nirvana is kind of the cessation of self. It's a cessation of suffering and desire. So, with that, it's always confused. Like, well, what are you left with? And when I think about it, it seems like desire is actually what creates life itself. Just think, you know, like a single cell organism, you know, having the desire to survive is what makes it live on and survive. So it seems like Buddhism. This seems, I don't know, it just makes sense. I guess, Shanna, could you explain it to me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
With Buddhism, it's different. It's not exactly how it sounds, which may be why it's a little confusing. But you know what? I'll just get straight to the point. It's not that kind of desire. It's not destroying or negating all desires ever. It's about desiring things that are outside of your moment that you're in, outside of the right now that you're experiencing. Like if I'm sitting in my room alone, right, I can be just sitting in my room alone, or I can desire to have someone here with me and then feel lonely, right? But I'm not actually lonely, I'm just desiring it for it to be another way than it is now. When we're sad or when we're depressed or when we're out of money or whatever, you're desiring it for life to be a way that it is not, and that causes your suffering, right? The teachings in Buddhism is more to accept the moment that you're in, honor the moment that you're in, move forward towards, you know, getting the moment that you're after, but not focusing on the I wish it were this way or that way. That's what they're talking about. Does that make more sense? I feel like I kind of jumbled it a little bit in the middle.
I mean, every time we take a breath, we desire to breathe, we desire to have oxygen in our
yes,
body.
it's not like that. It's not. It's the kind of desires that you don't literally think in your head, I hope I get to take my next breath. I wish I were taking my next breath. I'm now sad because I'm not at my next breath yet. What if my next breath never comes? What if I don't get to take that breath? What if somebody... You don't do that. You don't have like this self-torturing kind of cycle with breathing.
Well, when you're underwater, you are, though, right? When you're underwater, when you dive underwater, that's exactly what you're thinking.
Right. Okay. That's not what Buddhists are talking about.
But those situations come up all the time. I mean, when I get hungry, for example, I have a desire for food.
Right. It's not those kind of desires. It's the kind of desires that torture you, that do you harm. Right. You don't sit there and throw yourself into a depression over food.
Don't Buddhists want enlightenment? Like they desire that?
Right. I guess. Yeah. Well, I guess we have to understand what Shannon is saying about the different levels of desire. I guess.
The difficulty is that Buddhists often talk very sweepingly about nirvana and achieving a state of desirelessness. Now, when you know, desirelessness is pretty categorical. Right? You're saying no desire. But what happens? I stop being hungry. I stop desiring sleep. I stop desiring to move. I stop desiring to rest. I stop desiring, you know, relieving myself when I've got to go to the bathroom. I mean, you know, presumably it's not those kinds of things. It's presumably not those kinds of desires. It's not that. It's not desirelessness with respect to those.
Oh, yeah. They're going beyond the self. Going to beyond the self. Okay. And that ego.
It's okay. I've been practicing Zen Buddhism for the better part of a decade, and not at any point in any of the teachings that I've done or any of the masters that I've studied under has any of them tried to encourage me to not desire eating, breathing, sleeping, companionship. It's not those kind of desires. And I maybe just need to read a little bit more about it. Maybe I'm not communicating it effectively, and that's fine, but it's not those kind of desires. It's the kind of desires that torture you, that punish you, and you do it to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's wanting things.
Right.
That, I mean, there are these these rules about, you know, right action and right speech and stuff like that. There's sort of very often an emphasis on not just talking for the sake of talking and to fill the air with noise, but to actually try to communicate something, and being mindful about what you're saying, being mindful about what you're doing, not just engaging in not just going on autopilot, right?
Right.
There's a sort of the idea is there's an economy of thought and an economy of desire, and you want your desires to be appropriate and relevant. So it's not absolute desirelessness, but they do talk this way, and I mean, I think people have to be excused when when they don't see that, because I didn't see that until I read a couple of books on the subject, and I realized, oh, okay. But I sort of felt like, okay, well, all these other people out here talking about it wrong.
It does
but
sound.
these are people who are informed on the subject, who are talking about it in a way that I think is completely misleading.
Yeah, I'm sure I still don't get it, but I guess that's another hangout. All right, it's been an hour and 43 minutes. I think I'll wrap it up. Tanya, Wolf, or Xbox, would you like to say anything?
I have a question for Ozzy real quick, and forgive me if you've already said this. I just want to make sure I was understanding you earlier when I first came in when you were talking.
Mm-hmm.
Were you basically saying that the only, or one of the reasons why we even consider the idea of suffering is because we have the concept of heaven, like a place where there is no suffering? Just that we have the thought that there is a place with no suffering, like no suffering is good, apparently. So is that what you're saying? Like that's the reason why we're making? Oh,
No.
okay.
You probably came in the middle of the conversation. What I was arguing was that the reason the problem of suffering, not the existence of suffering, but the reason why the problem of suffering arises at all as an objection, and the reason that the problem of suffering needs to be answered by theists who posit a certain kind of God, is because they posit specifically a God that is all good, and is going to have to create the best of all possible worlds, right? He's not going to create a pretty good world. He has to create, because he's morally perfect, he has to create the best of all possible worlds. And since he sets up the very rules of reality and what the trade-offs are, and what is even possible, this God is in a position to, if he wanted to create a world where there was no suffering and there was just maximal happiness. He could just put us all in heaven now. Let's say heaven is great. He could just put us all in heaven right now, right? He can just cut to the chase and get us there right now. There's no reason why he couldn't do that if he so chose, right? Because there's nothing limiting him. There's nothing. There's no restriction on what he can do. He is, after all, omnipotent, and infinite power. He's effectively, everything is effortless for such a being. So the reason that the problem of suffering arises is in the first place is because we're positing that there is an agent responsible for what happens in the world. And if this agent is in a position to prevent harm and suffering, needless harm and suffering, then if there's any needless harm and suffering, that being is guilty of permitting it or causing it, unless there's a mitigating reason why he's doing it, a greater good. But of course, he could just bring this to the greater good immediately without this sort of Rube Goldberg machine of suffering along the way. None of that is necessary. So that's what I was saying is that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, doesn't exist if you don't posit this kind of God. So if you don't posit any God, there's no problem of like, why is there suffering? There's just a question of what causes suffering and what we can do about it. But the question, why is there suffering, doesn't arise, because suffering doesn't serve a function except a biological function. There's no moral reason for suffering to exist. All right, there are just causal reasons why suffering exists, but there's no moral reason, right? And similarly, like Shanna, for instance, is a deist, and I don't know enough about her, the God that she posits, but I don't think she posits an all-good God. Her God is a little closer to sort of my ruthless indifference, right? Hers is a God that sort of reigns on the just and the unjust, and sort of looks on, I think, with a certain indifference on what goes on in reality. That
My
kind of God, yeah.
Sorry, I was lighting matches.
Yeah, was I mischaracterizing your position there?
Nope.
Okay.
Sounds right.
Okay, so I mean, Shanna's God is not a God that beggars the question, why is there suffering? Because she's not positing a God that is all good. I mean, ask yourself this: supposing you posited a God that was just a diabolical evil, the question would no longer be why is there evil. We would know why there's evil in the world, because this God wanted there to be evil. The question would be, why is there any good at all in the world?
Yes, exactly.
It would be the problem of good that we have to explain away. And that's why apologists have to explain away the problem of evil. It's because they posit a good God. If they posit an evil God, they'd have to explain away the problem of why there's goodness in the world. But if you posit an indifferent God or a godless and indifferent reality, then the problem evaporates. There is no problem. The problem only arises because of a certain conception of God.
Okay, that makes total sense. So it's the question of why is there suffering if there wasn't this, creator who, has our good in mind. Then
yeah,
okay, I totally
it's
get what you're saying.
It's this idea that you get from evolution. The pitiless indifference is a phrase you'll hear come up over and over. And a world governed by an all-loving deity should not look identical to a world of pitiless indifference, just nature doing what nature does, right? I mean, those two shouldn't look the same, and yet we're being told that they are the same. That somehow the world that looks completely natural, and the natural suffering we see due to, like what Ozzy had said, starvation and biological or fungal infections or viral infections or predation and all these things that animals killing each other off, or just inability to compete for resources. All of the species that have gone extinct, they weren't sinning, right? I mean, they weren't evil. They just weren't as good in that situation at competing for resources, and they got outcompeted by other types of organisms. So I mean, that's cruel indifference. If your species is hunted to extinction, essentially hunted, not literally hunted, but you know what I mean. That doesn't seem to be the same as a universe created by God for some specific set of organisms. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah,
Right.
so essentially in a big universe like this, I mean, with regard to our apparent existence, the secrets behind evolution are essentially time and death. The capacity for survival is essentially how well you could actually stay fit to your environment. And given the fact that we are subject to selective pressures, it's not so much that, yeah, nature does have the capacity to be indifferent towards life, but it's only when organisms have the capacity to survive, which is basically just the strong surviving and the weak dying, that has the capacity to basically deliver us resources if we could actually utilize them to reduce suffering rather than have it increase. So I mean, if you're talking about an absolute good, all-knowing deity that personally has a sort of like a bias for our species in order to survive, it would be so perfect to the point that virtually anything could actually propagate itself and maintain and survive. However, with essentially not just our own species that have its own problems with regard to hunger, famine, like natural disasters and the like, but also millions of other species have been passed into existence as well. So, well, out of existence. So it's really a matter of acknowledging that it only makes sense only with the biological basis of suffering, not necessarily invoking some all-knowing justice that actually tries to deliver itself and try to make sense of itself, because that's just it's just not practical in that regard.
Yeah. Okay, I had another thought. I'd like to know what y'all think about this. And again, if this is already brought up, just tell me and I'll go back and watch it. But, okay, so let's just say there's no God at all. And there are, like, when I think of the word evil and suffering, I'm not thinking of, like, just suffering that happens because of survival reasons, you know what I mean? Like, I think of, like, this, I was talking to Shayna about this, like, a couple weeks ago. That horrible video that I saw of those people and what they did to the cat. That's all I'll say, okay, because it's really bad. Now, I think then it's okay to ask the question why, because no, there's not this like objectively moral good. However, most of civilization does not get off on causing suffering. So would it be okay to ask the question why in that case?
Why specifically what?
Why is there suffering? And why does that person like it?
The person who likes suffering, why do they like it?
Yeah, like wouldn't it be a moral issue then, even if there was no God?
Oh, hang on.
Go ahead, Ozzy.
Tell you, we're not talking about moral evil now. We're talking about natural evils. We're talking about animal suffering, just sort of organisms out in the wild, for instance. Okay, not people torturing animals and not people harming others. There's definitely a moral problem with people harming animals and people harming one another, right? Because there's an agent there. There's a responsible moral agent who's able to appreciate moral reasons and the mental states and experiences of others, right? But the question is, what about in the animal world, though? Does not a God who knows that the critters in the world that are not the critters in the world are not themselves moral agents, right? When an animal, a dog attacks you, it's not, it's not doing so out of evil. It's just doing so out of its blind nature. That's why we don't sort of try animals anymore like we used to do in the Middle Ages. We realize now that they don't work that way. But God, if He's inflicting harm or permitting harm to animals by the billions on a daily basis, then if He's in a position to prevent this, then there's a moral problem for God because He's permitting and causing all of this suffering that He could prevent.
So, so God's just as bad as those people I saw doing that to the cat.
Oh, He's much worse.
If I think about it.
He's much worse.
Yeah, there's a saying: if you see a blind person, kick him. Why be better than God?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't look at it that way, but yeah. Wow.
Yeah. I'm gonna finish up the on-air hangout now. I'm gonna finish with I guess two things. Rest in peace, Robin Williams. That's a real shock. And also, I'm going to end with a Bible verse. It's from the book of Ecclesiastes. It says, "For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity." All right, so with that, I'll wish everyone a good night. Thank you.